All right, so we're going to look at the election of 1824 and the extent to which the election of 1824 resulted in new political parties. So, if we are attempting to look at some of the causes here, one of the things we want to focus on is, political parties are often based on geographic differences, as we saw with Hamilton and the Federalist Party being in the Northeast and Jefferson, the Democratic Republican Party, being based in the South. Well, those regional differences that were kind of temporarily gone when the Federalist Party died off. But we started to see some things that started to show some cracks in that lack of regional differences. And we see the Missouri Compromise, which really starts to illustrate how free states, slave states, are developing a little bit differently. Um, we see Monroe vetoing the internal improvements bill for a road that funded by the federal government. So again, that's strict interpretation of the Constitution versus the kind of more loose constructionist idea. And then farmers are opposing tariffs on manufactured goods, right? Because that means higher prices for farmers, but that does benefit the northern manufacturers. So we start to see these interests of the North and South kind of starting to diverge a little bit here. And some of those old differences about interpretation of the Constitution are kind of coming up in the aftermath towards the end of this era of good feelings. A second area in which these controversies really kind of start to break the country apart is this controversy over the national bank. Because remember, political parties develop because you have different philosophies, and one of the different philosophies was over the national bank and who it was for and who it benefited, and even whether the national bank was something that should be done. So the Second Bank of the United States that was chartered in 1816, so 5 years after the first bank charter had lapsed. This is all part of Henry Clay's American system, which was a three-part system designed to strengthen the nation's economy. Because remember, Henry Clay was a nationalist. So he wanted to have these protective tariffs that would protect American industry. These are the ones that the farmers opposed. He wanted to have a national bank to kind of unify the financial system of the country. Because remember, in the 5 years prior to 1816, there were all these state banks that kind of created this chaotic financial system. And then the third was he wanted to federally fund internal improvements, roads and canals and that sort of thing, to facilitate and help trade throughout the country. So Henry Clay has this American system, and the Bank of the United States is a big part of this. Okay, but a lot of those things mean that it's more power to the federal government, and so that's something that there are people that are resisting. In addition, related to this controversy with the National Bank is the Panic of 1819. So, what had happened again before the Second Bank of the United States was chartered, you had lots of smaller state banks called wildcat banks that were loaning money. You had property values in the West rising because farmers had some more money because they had been trading a lot and being able to sell their crops for high prices. So they're looking to expand their farms. And so the value of land really increased. Well, in 1819, the National Bank said, you know what, all this lending money is getting out of control. So we're going to stop lending money. We're going to tighten credit. And so, and we're going to call in some of the loans from these Western farms. And a lot of these farmers were not able to pay those loans at that moment. So they were foreclosed on. That means that the government, or that means that those farmers lost their farms to the bank. So it created a lot of resentment from people in the West towards the national bank. They began to see the national bank as this kind of elitist kind of tool. All right, and then we also have like different kind of characteristics of candidates, right? We have John Quincy Adams, who was this candidate of the elites. He was a son of a former president, right? He was also, the Secretary of State under Monroe, and so he was kind of tagged with some of the things that happened under Monroe's presidency. He was seen that Western farmers saw themselves as regular plain people, and John Quincy Adams is this product of elite cities in the Northeast that they didn't quite understand, so they didn't really trust him. Another candidate in election of 1824 was Andrew Jackson. Now, this guy was a war hero, and he was seen as like a political outsider, right? Somebody who didn't subscribe to the elite viewpoint. He was a hero of Western farmers because he was actually from the West. He was born in Tennessee, and so he was from a Western state, and so they saw him as admirable. And then make sure that we can see this here. we have Henry Clay, who was a nationalist, right? He was this guy who was a war hawk before the War of 1812. He believed in having a strong nation, and he had proposed this American system to unify the country economically. So you really have three different types of people. You have John Quincy Adams, kind of the kind of elite, kind of traditional politician, former Secretary of State, taking that traditional path to the presidency. You have Andrew Jackson, this outsider who was seen as a hero to Western farmers because they saw themselves in him. We have Henry Clay, who's a nationalist who's trying to build up the American economy. So we get to the election of 1824. And this is known as the corrupt bargain election. I'll talk about that in a moment. And so this resulted in new political parties for a few different reasons. One is that John Quincy Adams was relatively weak, right? We have Georgia kind of ignoring John Quincy Adams over Indian removal. John Quincy Adams is basically telling Georgians to not take that land, and they are ignoring him and settling on Native American land, creating conflict, which will come about later on and result in the Trail of Tears. And then we have this tariff of abominations that was passed. So this was a tariff that really angered these southern farmers. It was seen as kind of like a punishment for farmers because it was a tariff on goods that were imported, which means higher prices for the farmers when they're trying to buy, equipment or whatever. And they saw that as this was a protective tariff that protected industries in the North. Okay, and it upset Western states and New Englanders too, because there were other tariffs on goods that New Englanders and Western states wanted. So not only did it anger Southern states because they were paying higher prices, but it also angered New England and Western states. So basically, everybody was angry about this tariff. Okay, so it didn't please anybody. So John Quincy Adams' presidency was not particularly strong. Next, we have the kind of end of the era of good feelings. And this is really about the kind of corrupt bargain, where Jackson accused Clay of trading support so he could become Secretary of State. And in this election, essentially what happened was none of those three candidates, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, none of them got a majority of the Electoral College. So that means the election goes to the House of Representatives. And Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House, so he had a lot of power in the House of Representatives. And so he was, when the states voted, and Henry Clay didn't like Andrew Jackson really. So when the states voted in the House of Representatives, they voted for John Quincy Adams. And so what ends up happening is, the supporters of Andrew Jackson feel like that's unfair because Jackson got the most votes of anybody. And so they felt that was like Henry Clay kind of used his position as Speaker of the House to influence that election. And they think he traded it for this position of Secretary of State, because Secretary of State was the position you wanted if you wanted to become president, even though there's no evidence of that actually occurring. And so we end up with two kind of new parties. You have the National Republicans, led by John Quincy Adams, and the kind of Democratic Republicans, led by Andrew Jackson. So essentially, the old Democratic Republican Party splits into two. We have National Republicans and Democratic Republicans. Okay, and we'll talk more about those differences a bit later on. But one of them is about who has more power, the national government or state governments. And then finally, we also have this beginning of this age of the common man. So we're moving away from the elite ideas of the Constitution, where only people with property could vote and that sort of thing. So when Andrew Jackson eventually comes back and wins the election of 1828, he's supported by these southern and western farmers who are generally poorer, they were less education, and they feel like they represent kind of like the regular person, not the elites of society like John Quincy Adams, right? And so Andrew Jackson accuses John Quincy Adams of kind of wasting government money and being corrupt and being a product of being this out of touch with kind of the American people. And so this idea of the common man becomes an important kind of thing that helps develop the Jacksonian Democrats. Okay, so all those things, this election of 1824 is this pivotal time where before 1824, we only have one political party. It's that era of good feelings. Afterwards, we develop back into another two-party system. This is called the second party system, where we start to end up with two separate parties with different ideas, different interests, and different geographic representation. Okay.